So today's class or success hours is on the form changes. They do these form changes almost every year. Some years it's significant, like last year we had an enormous amount of changes. This year it's still 34 pages, but that's not as significant as it was last year. But the best way to get the information is to read the legal bulletin. So what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through the actual form changes, but I'm going to invite all of you to go back and read the legal bulletin. So here's a 12-page legal bulletin that the MLS, oops, I just closed it by accident, that the MLS puts out every time they do these changes. All right? This summarizes revisions to many MLS forms, introduces new forms. The forms that have substantive revisions are the listing agreement, PSA, financing addendum, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of changes, right? So we're going to go through them. They've also added a lead-based paint disclosure for rentals, survey contingency, notice of seller consent to inspection. That's interesting. We'll have to read about that because there might be some reasoning behind it. The reasoning behind all of these changes will be in this legal document, legal update document, right? The forms themselves are also part of that posting that they just showed. So we're just going to walk through these forms. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is the revision date. You should always pay attention to these because sometimes you'll get offers where agents are using old forms. And if you study these forms and study these changes, you'll know why or what risk you might be absorbing because they took an old form, right? So this is the listing agreement. Here's the revision in red. Seller consents to firm receiving compensation from more than one party. So that's a clarification, right? The presumption in the listing agreement was that the seller pays the listing broker. In this climate, people are probably writing offers where the buyer's agent or buyer is saying, I'm going to throw more money at the listing broker in the hopes of getting my offer selected, right? This is funny. So we've always said selling broker and listing broker, and it's always been confusing because selling sounds like listing. So they've actually decided to change that term to buyer brokerage. So that's funny. If they do that throughout all these forms, that's a pretty big change because that's our vernacular, right? And I know I'm recording this, but please feel free to ask questions if you are so inclined. All right, new clause altogether, they added fair housing. Seller acknowledges that fair housing laws prohibit discrimination based on sex, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, creed, color, national origin, citizenship or immigration status, families with children, honorably discharged veteran or military status, blah, blah, blah. And I don't mean to undermine the significance of fair housing, but it looks like just an acknowledgement of something that's already been the case. So there must be some litigation that happened and the seller defended himself as saying, well, no one told me, or something like that. Now they can't say that. Closing, seller shall prepare and execute a certification under FERPTA. They got rid of at closing. Maybe that's because most of us are doing it at mutual. So they're just removing that timing of when it has to be done. They're just keeping the fact that it has to be done, right? So they've changed selling firm again. They capitalized agreement. That's funny. That should have been the case before. All of these red marks about the pagination or the paragraph numbering is because they added paragraph 8. So that changed everything down the road. So nothing major, just changed selling firm to buyer's brokerage, added the fair housing clause, and allowed us to get paid by more than one place. Any questions on the listing agreement before I move on? Okay. So this is 34 pages long because it's got a 6-page Form 21 plus Form 20, 25, and 28, I imagine. I mean, that's 48 pages right there. So maybe they only included page 1. I don't know. Let's look. All right. Line 7, they added wire as an option. And they added to be delivered blank days after mutual acceptance and who it's to be held by. Interesting. I wonder if they changed what paragraph B about earnest money. We're going to find out, right? They changed the agency disclosure. Yeah, they're getting rid of the term selling broker. So buyer represented by buyer broker or himself or the listing broker. Wait, buyer broker, buyer, dual agent, or unrepresented. I don't know the difference between being represented by himself or being unrepresented, but obviously there's a legal difference, I guess. Seller is represented by listing broker, dual agent listing broker, unrepresented, but the seller can't represent himself. That might be a typo then. I don't know. I'm not going to worry about it. Renaming, selling firm. Earnest money. So here's where we got to dig in, right? Buyers shall deliver the earnest money by the delivery date listed in specific term number 7, 2 days after mutual acceptance, if not filled in, to the party holding the earnest money, buyer brokerage firm or closing agent. If sent by mail, the earnest money must arrive at buyer brokerage firm or closing agent by the delivery date. If the earnest money is held by the buyer brokerage firm and is over 10,000, blah, 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 then they just change selling firm phraseology. So all they're doing is saying you can fill in a blank and change it, or it's 2 days if you leave it blank. Notice they've removed the 3 days if it's delivered to the buyer's broker. So change that in your head, because that's what it used to be and that is no longer the case. They've added garbage disposal. That's funny. I always wondered why they didn't. I wonder if, did they add it on page 1? No, we still got to type garbage disposal up there. That's funny. Although technically you don't, because it's referenced here. But you should, because you don't want anyone to be confused, right? FERPTA, big change in FERPTA. Provide certification to closing within 10 days of mutual. If seller fails to provide the FERPTA certification to the closing agent within 10 days of mutual, buyer may give notice that buyer may terminate the agreement at any time 3 days after the right to terminate notice. If seller has not earlier provided the FERPTA certification to the closing agent, buyer may give notice of this termination of this agreement anytime following 3 days. If buyer gives notice before seller provides FERPTA, this agreement is terminated and earnest money should be refunded. So they're giving the buyer leverage for those sellers who are sticks in the mud and won't disclose whether they're foreign or not. So that must have been happening with greater frequency than we realized, because I haven't had anybody refuse. So that's pretty interesting. Computation of time and change. All right. When counting backwards from closing, any period of time measured in days shall start on the day prior to closing, and if the last day is a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday as defined in RCW, blah, 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 the specified period time shall expire on the next day moving forward that is not a Saturday or Sunday. How often do you have to count backwards from closing? Maybe because of this? No, that's after mutual. All right. Does that make sense to everybody? So if closing is March 3rd and you're counting backwards, day 1 is March 2nd. Day 2 is March 1st. And if you're counting back 3 days, that falls on a Sunday. You would go forward to March 1st would be the day you're identifying. So if that's confusing to anyone, let's talk about it. A bunch.
Yeah, that I don't quite get that.
So what I can't think of a time where we had to count backwards from the closing date.
I always thought you started the day after you have mutual. And
right, but you're counting forward. So
yeah.
They're saying, like you could, well, walkthrough, right? You get to do the walkthrough up to 5 days prior to closing. But they never specified how you count those days.
Ah.
Right? So what they're doing is they're specifying, okay, if we're talking about a walkthrough and your close date is March 3rd today, it's interesting, they didn't say if it's 5 days you exclude weekends. All they said is if it falls on a weekend, you move forward. So let's say it's 3 days. So that's day 1, that's day 2, Sunday is day 3. Actually move forward to the first business day, which would be March 1st. So you have really just 2 days to do your walkthrough if my example case. All right, more changes about getting rid of the term selling broker. Property condition. In addition, some properties may contain soil or other contaminants that is not readily apparent to be hazardous. Brokers do not have the expertise to identify or assess. That protects you and I. So that's a good thing. Financing. Oh, we get changing the waiver. Let's see. It's interesting that they struck waiver of contingency, because there's a clause right here that says waiver of contingency. So let's really dig into this one because they may have changed a lot, right? So the first change is, if not waived, the financing contingency shall survive the closing date. That was already in here. I'm not sure why they have to say it again, but they clearly want to make it more apparent. This is interesting. They struck the application. Oh no, they struck it and then they added it back. So I don't, maybe that was an accident. Waiver of financing. If buyer fails to make application, changes the loan type, or changes the lender without the prior written consent, then the financing is deemed waived. So that's all the same. Buyer waives of the financing contingency under this paragraph also constitute waiver of paragraph 5. So low appraisal is now a new paragraph number. So they've deleted a lot of paragraphs apparently. Let's keep reading. For purposes of this addendum, lender means either the party to whom the application was submitted or the party funding the loan. Buyer authorizes the listing broker and seller to inquire about the status of buyer's loan approval with lender at any time prior to closing. Buyer will execute an authorization form if required by lender to accomplish the same. So some people would argue you used to only get one chance to ask, how's it going? And that was in this paragraph 2A. But now they've made it so you can ask anytime along the way, right? So financing contingency, select A or B. A is seller's notice to perform. And B is automatic waiver. Okay, wow, they got rid of 3A. Some major changes here. So we're going to go through this kind of slow. All right. So it now says seller's notice to perform. At any time, blank days, 21 if not filled in after mutual acceptance, seller may give notice to perform, requesting that buyer waive the financing contingency, and that seller may, holy cow, may terminate the agreement at any time 3 days after delivery of that notice if buyer does not earlier waive. 22 AR can be used for this notice. Okay, so they're getting rid of the 10-day, what used to be a 10-day default, you know, use 22 AL and 22 AP. And they're basically moving up this paragraph 3A. So they're saying you can skip that and go straight to setting up the 21 or 30 day, whatever length of time you choose. Or, let's see, seller may give notice. If buyer's waiver will or will not. They changed this. Remember in my previous videos, I always said this is the only clause in all of our forms where if you left it blank, it inures to the benefit of the seller, and they have now made it so it goes to the benefit of the buyer. That's funny. All right. Or B, automatic waiver. The financing contingency shall conclusively be deemed waived unless within blank days after mutual, buyer gives notice of termination. If buyer gives timely notice of termination, the earnest money shall be refunded. And then they still have the will or will not affect below appraisal. So they're basically saying it's like the feasibility. You know how in feasibility you can make it so that it automatically terminates or it doesn't. That's the option you're being given here. So if you represent a buyer, you can, to be more aggressive, choose the automatic waiver. Or if you want to be more traditional, like we've been in the past, you can use the notice to perform, which basically says, hey, the seller has to compel me to waive, but it doesn't waive automatically. The difference is not only that mechanism for waiving, but also this waives financing automatically, which normally financing survives closing, right? We said that at the beginning. So that's interesting. In fact, let's look at the legal bulletin and see why they did that. To simplify the form, the paragraph regarding loan information has been removed. Of course, the seller and listing broker can periodically inquire about the status of the buyer's loan with the buyer broker, and with the lender. To that end, in paragraph 1B, the buyer authorizes the seller and the listing broker to inquire about the status of the buyer's loan. 22 AL and AP will be removed. The revised form provides two options for the financing contingency in new paragraph 2. The first, entitled Seller's Notice to Perform, is similar to the current form. After the agreed upon time, the new default is 21 days. The seller may give a notice to perform to the buyer, requesting the buyer waive the financing contingency. If the buyer does not waive financing, then after 3 days, the seller may terminate the agreement. Earnest money should be refunded to the buyer. This is the same process with slightly different terminology and default timelines that has been used in 22A for years. The new second option, entitled Automatic Waiver of Financing, provides that, similar to other contingencies in the purchase and sale, the financing will automatically waive after a certain number of days. Buyer may elect to terminate the agreement at any time before the contingency is automatically waived, but in order to be entitled to the earnest money, the buyer must provide written confirmation from the lender showing the date of the buyer's application for the property was made, including a copy of the loan estimate, that the buyer possessed sufficient funds. So this is all similar to what it was before. You can't just terminate under financing. You got to prove that you couldn't get the loan. Notice that the automatic waiver option contains significant risks for the buyer. If the buyer agrees to an automatic waiver, the buyer should make sure to carefully select a lender and make complete and thorough loan application as early as in the process as possible. Both financing contingency options allow the parties to negotiate whether a waiver of the contingency constitutes a waiver of the appraisal provision. The default is that a waiver of the financing does not also waive appraisal less than sale price provision. The automatic waiver option, this provision is important as a buyer has no control with regard to whether the appraisal be conducted before the automatic waiver date. Interesting. Does that make sense to everybody? Paragraph 6 has been struck. Seller shall permit inspections required by lender, but including but not limited to structural, pests, heating, roof, blah, blah, blah. Interesting. I don't know why they would strike that. Low appraisal is now paragraph 5 and has no changes to it. So they moved paragraph 6 and just put it after low appraisal so that it would stay in paragraph 6. That's probably just for pagination because it's referred to in other parts of the agreement. That's just to any other provisions, VA, a mandatory clause. If the buyer is obtaining VA financing, it is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provisions of this contract, purchaser shall not incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money or otherwise be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein if the contract purchase price or cost exceeds the reasonable value of the property established by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Purchaser shall, however, have the privilege and option of proceeding. So they're saying when it's a VA buyer, you can't force them to overpay. So if the appraisal comes in low, the VA buyers automatically get the right to get out of it. Conventional buyers have the right too, but they have to go through the process of submitting the appraisal and giving notice of low appraisal. All right, this is formerly 22 AD, still is called AD. And they've added financing addendum form 22A. This increased down payment low appraisal addendum supersedes appraisal less than sales price provision. If the buyer's lender will provide. So this is all just to change the capitalization because now this is the leading paragraph. So those are all the same. This second option, appraisal addendum form 22AA. This increased down payment for low appraisal addendum modifies the appraisal addendum form 22AA. So if you want to communicate that your buyer is going to put more down and you used form 22AA to do that, which is the appraisal requirement form, but not a financing contingency, then you would check this second paragraph and say, we're going to put more down if needed. But most will have 22A, and you're going to check the first paragraph and say, we're going to put more money down. All right. Buyer becomes aware. Oops. Seller may deliver notice to buyer within 3 days, reducing purchase price, terminating the agreement. Yeah. All right. Notice for increased down payment. This is not a new form. ADN. Buyer gives notice that the sum of Steve, I'm going to mute you. Or you can mute yourself. All right. Buyer gives notice that the sum of the appraised value and the additional funds is blank, which is an amount less than the purchase. Then the seller can either consent or terminate. All right. 22AR. This is the changes. Remember in 22A, they changed it to a notice to perform. So that's expected. They would have to change that. Here's a contingency. So this is the sale of your current home contingency. Buyer's waiver of this contingency also waives all other conditions in this agreement, including financing. That was already in there. Maybe they just updated it. Buyer shall give notice to the seller within 2 days if the buyer's property has failed. Such notice must be given regardless of whether buyer chooses to proceed with the agreement. If the sale of the buyer's property fails to close through no fault of the buyer before expiration, the contingency shall be reinstated until the contingency period is expired. That was already in there. Agreement terminates unless buyer waives. Square footage. That's just changing the terminology for selling broker to buyer's broker. Utilities. Electricity, cable, and internet. So they just resorted it and added space to name the providers. That's just kind of tidying things up. 22J. So remember that I said they've created a renter's version or lessee's version of 22J. So they remove the references to lessee because they're going to have their own form. Remove the lease, all references to less. I wouldn't have thought that was necessary, but they did. Septic. Oh, subjective satisfaction. So that just clarifies buyer's approval doesn't have to be substantiated with anything other than their own opinion. I love this change because this has always been my opinion, but it's an opinion that could have been argued. If you give the title report as a supplement in your listing, then the timeline could be argued already started. But they're saying if buyer receives title before mutual, times to review shall begin on mutual. So that's good. It's clean. Inspection. Ooh, changes to this. Huh? Buyer's general home inspection must be formed by buyer or a person licensed under RCW blah, blah, blah. Buyer may engage specialists to conduct further inspection. That kind of was already the case, so I'm not sure why they had to clarify. This inspection contingency shall conclusively be deemed waived, and seller shall not be obligated to make any repairs or modification unless within 10 days after mutual of this agreement, buyer gives notice. Inspection report. Buyer shall not provide the inspection report portion of the report. So they're changing the waiver part. If buyer provides any portion of the inspection report to seller without seller's prior written consent or as required, the inspection contingency shall be deemed waived. Thank God. When they rolled out that you couldn't give the report to the listing broker or the seller, but gave no penalty if you did, it basically neutered the language because people would do it and there wasn't any repercussions. Now they're saying if you do it, you're waiving inspection. That's awesome. So hear that loud and clear. If you're a buyer's agent, your buyer performs an inspection. If you provide that report to the seller without them asking for it, you just waived your buyer's inspection. And that is catastrophic. Don't do it. Now, hopefully they clarified on what sort of evidence do you need for their consent. So let's read the next clause, seller consent. Selection of either box below by seller shall not be considered a counteroffer. Seller requests that the buyer provide the inspection report. If buyer requests repairs or modifications to the agreement, seller requests the buyer provide only those portions. So when you talk to the listing broker and say, hey, we got some issues, they're going to say, okay, well, send me the report. You need to tell them, please have your client initial one of the boxes on Form 35 so that I have it documented, right? Additional time, 5 days for inspections as recommended by the inspector. That was understood. Now it's just clearer. Buyer's request for repairs under paragraph 3. So they just changed the numbering. Buyer's inaction during buyer's reply period shall result in the waiver of the inspection, in which case seller shall not be obligated to make any repairs. That was already the case. Oh, why'd they get rid of those? That's interesting. I don't like that they got rid of those. I want my buyer to acknowledge that they're deciding on their own to waive. That's interesting to me. Let's see what they thought or why they thought that. Wow, the word waive is in here a lot, isn't it? All right. They've been moved to a new form, 35W. See, I just should have been patient. I could have been educated. All right, the escalator has changed. Your purchase price is capitalized. You're further cautioned rather than advised by the seller or listing broker may disclose the terms of your offer, including this addendum to other buyers. That was already in there. Net price means the stated purchase price or the maximum price for the competing offer if it contains an escalator, including any price adjustments such as credits for closing costs or credits to seller. So people are offering credits to seller in excess of the purchase price, and I have seen that. So they're just modifying this form to allow for that. Competing offer required for escalation. Seller's escalation of this offer shall not be effective unless it's accompanied by a complete copy of a competing offer used to escalate purchase price, including any escalation provision. If seller fails to provide at the time of mutual, then buyer shall be entitled the Wow, that's cool. So Matt, this language would have allowed your client to buy that Ocean Shores property for the list price, or your starting price. Because if you don't include the competing offer when you deliver it, that's a huge change and a huge mistake. If the offer provided by the seller does not qualify as a competing offer under paragraph 2 of this addendum, buyer shall deliver notice to seller of that fact within 3 days. If buyer fails to give timely notice, the offer shall conclusively be deemed to qualify. That's a change. If buyer provides such notice, seller shall have blank days to give notice of termination. If seller timely gives such notice, earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. If seller does not give timely notice, buyer shall be entitled to buy it at the non-escalated price. That's kind of cool. Buyer shall use the escalation addendum notice or notices required by this section. New purchase price. Escalated price. Following formula calculates the new purchase price. The new purchase price can only be calculated when the purchase price of the competing offer is known. Purchase price of competing offer. Less credits, plus credits to seller. So that has been happening, so they've added that. Or less credits. If the new purchase price calculated by the seller is incorrect, buyer shall deliver notice of that fact within 3 days. If buyer fails to give timely notice, it's deemed to be correct. If buyer gives that notice, seller has 2 days to respond, and then they can terminate. Parties shall use escalation addendum for notices required by this section. 35R. Buyer provides any portion of the inspection report to the seller without the consent, it's deemed waived. Seller agrees to modifications. Described below are attached pages. That's all pretty standard. Huh? I reject seller's response, but offers the attached alternative proposal. That's funny. This is a random form, but it's the bottom of this form, I think. Anyway, 38A. So they didn't give us form 35AN or whatever it was, RN. So backup addendum. Or just, wow. Where's 35W? Maybe it's in here. Yeah. There it is, 35W. So you can waive, you can do a pre-inspection, modifications or repairs. They just separated it out. All right.